They say she died believing she was pregnant with the heir that would restore Catholic England. But her swollen belly held only death. Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, spent her entire life fighting for legitimacy, for love, for a legacy that would crumble the moment she drew her last breath. Tonight, by the gentle light of the fire, we'll discover how England's first queen regnant became its most feared. But before we journey into the flames that would consume nearly 300 souls, we must begin at the beginning. We must understand the girl who became the monster. For Mary Tudor was not born evil. She was crafted by circumstance, forged by betrayal, and hardened by a lifetime of watching everything she loved turn to ash. February 18th, 1516. Greenwich Palace. The royal birthing chamber fills with the cries of a newborn, and for a moment, all of England holds its breath. Henry VIII, that towering figure of English history, bursts into the chamber with hope blazing in his eyes. He has waited 7 years for this moment, 7 years of marriage to Catherine of Aragon, 7 years of prayers, pilgrimages, and desperate hope for the son who would secure the Tudor dynasty. But the midwife's face tells him everything. The baby is healthy, the birth successful, but the child is a girl, not the prince England needs, not the heir Henry has demanded from God himself. Yet as he looks down at the tiny red-faced infant, something softens in the king's expression. This is his daughter, his firstborn, his little Mary. Catherine of Aragon, exhausted but triumphant on her birthing bed, watches her husband's face carefully. She knows this disappointment. She has carried the weight of it through miscarriages, lost hopes, tiny graves that haunt her dreams. But this child lives. This child breathes. This child is theirs. She is perfect, Catherine whispers, her Spanish accent thick with emotion. God has blessed us with a daughter, Henry, a princess for England. Henry nods slowly. Yes, Mary is not the son he craved, but she is a beginning. She is proof that Catherine can bear living children. Surely a son will follow. Surely this is just the first of many. He leans down and touches the baby's tiny hand, marveling at her perfect fingers, her steady breathing, the way she seems to look directly at him with eyes that already hold a disturbing intelligence. Mary, he says softly, named for my sister and for the Blessed Virgin. You will be England's jewel, little one. And for the first 2 years of her life, Mary Tudor truly was England's jewel. The court doted on her. Foreign ambassadors remarked on her beauty and intelligence, and Henry paraded her before visitors like a treasured possession. She had her father's red gold hair and her mother's steady gaze. Even as a toddler, she carried herself with a dignity that seemed almost supernatural. The Venetian ambassador wrote to his master, "The Princess Mary, though barely walking, displays a gravity and composure that would befit a woman of 30. She observes all around her with intelligent eyes and seems to understand far more than her tender years should allow." Mary's early education was nothing short of extraordinary. Catherine, herself one of the most learned women of her age, oversaw every aspect of her daughter's intellectual development. By age 4, Mary was learning Latin. By 5, she could read and write in English, Spanish, and French. By 6, she was studying history, philosophy, and theology with some of the finest scholars in Europe. But it was not just book learning that shaped young Mary. She was raised in the full splendor of the Tudor court, surrounded by tapestries depicting the family's rise to power, portraits of her grandfather Henry VII, who had wrested the crown from Richard III at Bosworth Field, and constant reminders that she was born to rule. Every day, she watched her father hold court, make decisions that affected millions, and wield absolute power with the casual confidence of a man born to command. More importantly, she watched her mother. Catherine of Aragon was not just a queen consort. She was a political force in her own right, daughter of the mighty Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Catherine had been raised to rule. When Henry left England to wage war in France, it was Catherine who served as regent. Catherine who organised the defence against Scottish invasion. Catherine who sent her husband the bloodied coat of the Scottish King James IV after English forces destroyed the Scottish army at Flodden. A queen, Catherine would tell her daughter during their long walks through the palace gardens, is not merely an ornament for a king. A queen is a guardian of her people, a mother to her nation, and a sword in the hand of God. Never forget, Mija, that royal blood carries divine responsibility. These lessons sank deep into Mary's young mind. She understood, even as a child, that she was not ordinary. She was chosen by God, blessed with royal blood, destined for greatness. When foreign princes came to court, it was not uncommon for them to suggest marriage alliances for the young princess. Mary would stand beside her father, curtsy with perfect grace, and speak in whatever language the visitor required. She was being groomed not just as a princess, but as a future queen. The French ambassador, Jean du Bellay, observed in a letter to King Francis I, the English princess, though young, displays a command of statecraft that would shame many grown men. She speaks with the authority of one born to rule, and I fear that if she were ever to inherit the English crown, she would prove a formidable opponent to our interests. But beneath the golden surface of Mary's early childhood, cracks were already beginning to show. Henry's desperate need for a son had not diminished with Mary's birth. If anything, it had grown stronger. Each passing year without a male heir was another year of dynastic insecurity. Each miscarriage Catherine suffered was another step toward catastrophe. Henry began to whisper to his advisors about the curse that seemed to follow him. Perhaps God was displeased with his marriage. Perhaps there was some sin, some transgression that prevented the birth of a son. The king's chaplains assured him that his marriage to Catherine was blessed by God and sanctioned by the Pope, but doubt gnawed at Henry's mind like a cancer. And Mary, precocious child that she was, began to sense the growing tension in her parents' relationship. She noticed how her father's visits to her mother's chambers became less frequent. She saw how Catherine's face would tighten when courtiers whispered about the king's need for a son. She heard the arguments that her parents thought were private, conducted in fierce whispers behind closed doors. "You promised me sons, Catherine," Henry's voice would carry through the palace corridors. "God promised me sons if I married my brother's widow. Where are my sons?" "God has given us Mary," Catherine would reply, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "She is healthy, intelligent, beloved by the people. Why is she not enough?" "Because England needs a king," Henry would roar. "A woman cannot rule. A woman cannot lead armies, cannot command respect, cannot what?" Catherine's voice would turn cold as winter steel. "Cannot rule as my mother Isabella ruled Castile. Cannot command as I commanded when you were playing soldier in France. Cannot inspire loyalty as I have inspired loyalty for 20 years in this country." These arguments would end in bitter silence, and Mary would retreat to her chambers, wondering what terrible sin she had committed simply by being born female. She began to pray more fervently, spending hours on her knees before the crucifix in her private chapel, begging God to forgive whatever fault in her had disappointed her father. Her tutors, wise in the ways of court politics, began to subtly adjust Mary's education. If she could not be the son Henry needed, perhaps she could at least prove herself worthy of respect in other ways. They intensified her studies in theology and statecraft, reasoning that a princess who could debate scripture with bishops and discuss policy with ambassadors might overcome the disadvantage of her sex. Mary threw herself into her studies with the desperate intensity of a drowning person grasping for a rope. She mastered Latin so thoroughly that she could compose original poetry in the language. She studied the lives of female saints and rulers, seeking examples of women who had wielded power successfully. She memorized genealogies and treaties, determined to prove that her mind was as sharp as any prince's. But even as Mary's intellect flourished, her world began to shift in ways she could not yet understand. At court, new faces appeared, young women, beautiful and charming, who seemed to capture her father's attention in ways that her mother no longer could. Mary noticed how these women would giggle at her father's jokes, how they would find excuses to brush against his hand, how they would gaze at him with adoration that seemed both calculated and genuine. Her mother noticed too. Catherine's prayers became longer, her fasts more severe, her charitable works more intense. She seemed to be trying to purchase God's favor through suffering, as if her own pain might somehow restore her husband's love and grant her the son he demanded. "Mama," Mary asked one evening as they sat together in Catherine's private chambers, working on their embroidery by candlelight, "why does Papa seem so sad?" Catherine's needle paused mid-stitch. For a long moment, she stared at the religious scene she was creating, the Annunciation, with the angel Gabriel kneeling before the Virgin Mary. How fitting, she thought bitterly, that she should be embroidering the image of a woman blessed with a miraculous son, when her own womb had proven such a disappointment. "Your father," Catherine said carefully, "carries the weight of England on his shoulders. Kings are never truly happy, Mija. They trade peace for power, and the burden never lifts." Mary nodded solemnly, filing this information away. Even at 8 years old, she understood that her parents were teaching her more through their pain than they ever could through their words. She was learning that royal marriage was not about love, but about duty, that queens existed to produce heirs, not to find happiness, that even princesses were valuable only insofar as they served the needs of the dynasty. But perhaps most importantly, she was learning that women in power lived in constant jeopardy. Her mother, despite her intelligence, her piety, her loyalty, was slowly being discarded because she had failed in the one task that truly mattered. Mary filed this lesson away deep in her heart, where it would fester and grow and eventually transform into something much darker. The year 1525 marked a turning point in Mary's young life, though she wouldn't understand its full significance for several more years. Henry, increasingly frustrated with Catherine's failure to produce a son, made a decision that shocked the European diplomatic community. He elevated his illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, born to his mistress Bessie Blount, to the peerage, granting him titles and honours that made clear his father's intentions. Mary watched the ceremony with a mixture of confusion and growing dread. This boy, younger than her, born outside of marriage, was being publicly acknowledged as Henry's heir. The message was unmistakable. Better a bastard son than a legitimate daughter. "Do not let this trouble you, my darling," Catherine whispered to Mary as they stood in the great hall, watching Fitzroy kneel before his father to receive his honours. "You are the true-born princess. No bastard can steal that from you." But Mary could see the fear in her mother's eyes, could hear the uncertainty beneath her confident words. For the first time in her life, Mary began to understand that her position was not as secure as she had believed. She was not simply a princess. She was a placeholder, keeping the throne warm until a more suitable heir could be found. That night, Mary lay awake in her chamber, staring at the tapestries that depicted her family's rise to power. Her grandfather, Henry VII, had won the crown through conquest. Her father had inherited it through birth, but how would she claim it if the time came? Could a woman truly rule England? The question haunted her dreams and would continue to do so for the rest of her life. The seeds of Mary's future ruthlessness were planted in these early moments of understanding. She began to realize that her very existence was political, that her value was conditional, that love itself could be withdrawn if she failed to serve the needs of the dynasty. She was 9 years old, and already she was learning to think like a survivor. As Mary entered her 10th year, her education took on new urgency and complexity. Catherine, perhaps sensing that her daughter's future was far from certain, threw herself into preparing Mary for whatever challenges might lie ahead. The princess's day began before dawn, with prayers, and continued with an exhausting schedule of lessons that would have broken lesser minds. Master Juan Luis Vives, the renowned Spanish humanist, had been commissioned to design Mary's curriculum. His approach was revolutionary for its time. He believed that women, particularly royal women, should receive the same rigorous intellectual training as men. Under his guidance, Mary's studies expanded to include not just languages and religious instruction, but also natural philosophy, mathematics, and what we would now call political science. A princess, Vives explained to Catherine during one of their planning sessions, must be prepared for any eventuality. If God wills that she should rule, she must have the knowledge to do so wisely. If she is destined to marry a foreign prince, she must be able to represent English interests with intelligence and dignity. In either case, ignorance would be a catastrophic weakness. Mary embraced her studies with an intensity that impressed even her demanding tutors. She rose each morning at 5, attended Mass, and then spent 12 hours in focused learning. She read Plutarch's Lives in the original Greek, studying the careers of ancient rulers and extracting lessons about leadership, strategy, and the price of power. She memorized vast passages of scripture, not just in Latin, but in Hebrew, seeking to understand God's will through direct study of His Word. But it was her study of contemporary politics that truly set Mary apart from other princesses of her age. Catherine insisted that her daughter understand the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and interests that shaped European politics. Maps covered the walls of Mary's study chamber, marked with the territories of various rulers, the trade routes that connected nations, and the strategic points that had determined the outcomes of recent wars. England, Catherine would tell her daughter, pointing to their island nation on the great map, appears small compared to France or the Holy Roman Empire, but our position is our strength. We are protected by the sea, but we can strike at any point along the continental coast. We can tip the balance between greater powers simply by choosing our allies wisely. Mary absorbed these lessons with frightening efficiency. By age 11, she could discuss the implications of the Battle of Pavia with the same sophistication as Henry's own counselors. She understood that her cousin, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, represented both England's greatest potential ally and its most dangerous potential enemy. She grasped the religious implications of Martin Luther's rebellion in Germany and could articulate why the Protestant movement represented an existential threat to traditional monarchy. More personally, she began to understand the precarious nature of her own position. Through careful observation and intelligent questioning, Mary pieced together the crisis that was slowly consuming her parents' marriage. Henry's frustration with Catherine's failure to produce a son was no longer a private matter. It was becoming a diplomatic issue that affected England's relationships with foreign powers. The Venetian ambassador, Marco Foscari, noted in a dispatch to the Doge, "The Princess Mary displays an understanding of statecraft that would be remarkable in a seasoned diplomat." During a recent conversation about the French marriage negotiations, she demonstrated a grasp of the financial and strategic implications that surprised even the king's own advisors. One suspects that if she were male, she would already be considered one of Europe's most promising young rulers. But Mary's precocious political intelligence came at a personal cost. The more she understood about her situation, the more isolated she became from the normal pleasures of childhood. While other noble children played games and enjoyed festivals, Mary found herself constantly analysing the political implications of every interaction. When foreign ambassadors visited court, Mary no longer saw them as exotic guests bringing gifts and stories from distant lands. Instead, she saw them as potential allies or enemies, calculating how their nation's interests aligned with England's. When courtiers paid her compliments, she wondered whether they were genuine expressions of affection or strategic investments in her potential future power. This hyper-awareness extended to her observation of her parents' relationship. Mary began to notice things that even many adults missed. The way her father's eyes would linger on certain ladies of the court, the careful distance Catherine maintained during public ceremonies, the increasing frequency with which Henry found excuses to avoid family gatherings. She also noticed the whispers. Servants thought they were being discreet, but Mary had learned to move silently through the palace corridors, to position herself where she could overhear conversations that were not meant for her ears. She heard the speculation about Henry's growing interest in Anne Boleyn, one of her mother's own ladies-in-waiting. She heard the debates about whether the king's marriage to Catherine was valid in the eyes of God. She heard the terrible word, annulment, spoken in hushed tones. Mary was 12 years old when she first truly understood what an annulment would mean for her personally. It would not simply dissolve her parents' marriage. It would declare that no valid marriage had ever existed. And if there had been no marriage, then she herself was illegitimate. She would go from being the Princess of England to being a bastard, her claim to the throne no stronger than that of Henry Fitzroy. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was in her private chapel, kneeling before the crucifix as she did every evening, when the full implications finally crystallized in her mind. If her father succeeded in setting aside his marriage to her mother, then everything Mary had been taught about her destiny, everything she had prepared for, everything she was, would be swept away. That night, Mary prayed with a desperation she had never felt before. She begged God to preserve her parents' marriage, not out of sentiment, but out of survival instinct. She promised to dedicate her life to his service, if he would only prevent her father from destroying the foundation of her existence. But even as she prayed, a darker part of her mind was already calculating alternatives. If legitimacy could be stripped away by royal decree, then perhaps it could be restored the same way. If marriage could be declared invalid by papal dispensation, then perhaps new marriages could establish new claims. If the succession could be altered by parliamentary statute, then perhaps it could be altered again by future statutes. Mary was learning the most crucial lesson of her life. Power was not inherited or deserved, but seized and held by those with the will to do whatever was necessary. It was a lesson that would shape every decision she made for the rest of her life. The year 1527 changed everything for Mary Tudor, though she would not understand the full scope of that change for several more years. It was the year her father publicly announced his intention to seek an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. It was the year Anne Boleyn transformed from a lady-in-waiting into the most powerful woman in England. And it was the year Mary's world began its inexorable slide toward chaos. Anne Boleyn was everything Catherine was not. Where the Queen was Spanish, solemn and devoutly Catholic, Anne was English, vivacious, and intellectually curious about the new religious ideas sweeping across Europe. Where Catherine had spent 20 years trying to give Henry a son, Anne promised to succeed where the Queen had failed. Most dangerously of all, where Catherine had grown comfortable in her power, Anne hungered for it with an intensity that matched Henry's own. Mary watched Anne's rise with the cold calculation of a natural strategist. She had been trained to observe court politics, and what she saw both fascinated and terrified her. Anne Boleyn was not simply seducing a king, she was orchestrating a revolution. "She refuses to become his mistress," Mary overheard her mother's ladies whispering. "She demands marriage or nothing. Can you imagine such boldness?" Mary could indeed imagine it, and she grudgingly admired Anne's strategy even as she hated its implications for her own future. Anne understood that Henry's previous mistresses had gained temporary influence but no lasting power. By refusing to surrender her virtue without the promise of a crown, Anne was forcing Henry to choose between his desire and his dynasty. It was a breathtakingly dangerous gamble. If Henry tired of the pursuit, Anne would be discarded and probably exiled. But if she could maintain his interest long enough, she might actually achieve the impossible. She might become Queen of England. Mary began to study Anne with the intensity of a scholar examining a rare manuscript. During public ceremonies, she would position herself where she could observe Anne's interactions with the king and court. She noted how Anne had learned to alternate displays of affection with strategic withdrawals, keeping Henry perpetually off balance. She saw how Anne carefully cultivated relationships with reform-minded nobles and clergy, building a faction that could support her revolutionary aspirations. Most importantly, Mary observed how Anne was positioning herself not merely as Henry's beloved, but as his intellectual partner. Anne spoke knowledgeably about theology and politics, offering opinions that challenged conventional wisdom. She read books that had been banned by the church, discussed ideas that bordered on heresy, and encouraged Henry to see himself not as a vassal of the Pope, but as a sovereign answerable only to God. She is teaching Papa to be a different kind of king, Mary confided to her closest friend and cousin, Reginald Pole, during one of his visits to court. Not a Catholic king who obeys the church, but a king who makes the church obey him. Reginald, who would later become one of Mary's most bitter enemies, nodded thoughtfully. "And what do you think of such ideas, cousin?" Mary was silent for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "I think that any woman who can convince a king to reshape an entire kingdom for her sake is either very wise or very dangerous. Perhaps both." As 1528 turned into 1529, the king's great matter, as the annulment proceedings came to be known, dominated English politics. Henry's case rested on a complex theological argument about the validity of his marriage to his brother's widow. According to Leviticus, such unions were forbidden by God and would be punished with childlessness. The fact that Catherine had produced no surviving sons was, in Henry's mind, proof of divine displeasure. Catherine's response was devastatingly simple. Her marriage to Arthur, Henry's deceased brother, had never been consummated. She had come to Henry as a virgin, making their union valid in the eyes of God, regardless of any technical impediments. She would not accept the annulment, would not retire quietly to a convent, would not cooperate in her own destruction. Mary found herself caught between two brilliant, determined women who were fighting for her father's soul, and by extension, for the future of England itself. She loved her mother deeply and believed in the justice of Catherine's cause. But she also recognized the political genius of Anne Boleyn's strategy and could not help but admire the audacity of a woman who dared to reshape a kingdom to suit her ambitions. The strain of living in this impossible situation began to show in Mary's behavior and health. She had always been a serious child, but now she became almost obsessively studious, throwing herself into her books as if scholarship could somehow shield her from the chaos surrounding her family. She began to suffer from headaches and stomach ailments that her physicians could not explain, but that clearly stemmed from the constant stress of her situation. More troubling still, Mary began to display signs of the psychological instability that would plague her throughout her life. She became suspicious of the motives behind every kindness, convinced that courtiers were constantly evaluating her worth as a political asset. She started testing the loyalty of her servants through small deceptions, trying to determine who could be trusted and who might betray her if circumstances changed. Her relationship with her father grew increasingly complex during this period. Henry still loved Mary in his way, but their interactions became strained by the unspoken question of her legitimacy. When they spoke of politics or theology, Henry would sometimes seem to forget that Mary was Catherine's daughter and would treat her as an intellectual equal. But then, some reminder of the annulment proceedings would surface, and he would withdraw into guilt and embarrassment. "You are my daughter," Henry told Mary during one particularly difficult conversation. "Nothing will ever change that. Whatever happens between your mother and me, you will always be my beloved child." Mary, now 14 and far too sophisticated to be comforted by such platitudes, simply nodded and smiled. She understood that her father was trying to convince himself as much as her. If the annulment succeeded, if her parents' marriage was declared invalid, then she could no longer be his daughter in any legal sense. She would become, officially, his bastard niece. The summer of 1529 brought the great trial at Blackfriars. where Henry's case for annulment was presented before papal legates. Mary was not permitted to attend, but she followed every development through a network of informants that included sympathetic courtiers, her mother's Spanish ladies, and even some of her own tutors who were keeping careful track of the proceedings. Catherine's appearance at the trial became the stuff of legend. The Queen knelt before Henry in open court, proclaiming her innocence and her love, insisting that she was his true wife before God and man. Then she walked out of the proceedings entirely, refusing to participate in what she considered an illegitimate charade. Mary felt a complicated mixture of pride and dread when she heard about her mother's dramatic gesture. Pride because Catherine had shown magnificent courage in defending her position. Dread because such public defiance would surely provoke Henry's wrath and make reconciliation impossible. That autumn, the papal legates departed England without rendering a decision, effectively stalling Henry's case indefinitely. Anne Boleyn had been patient for 2 years, but now she began to pressure Henry more directly. She could not wait forever for him to resolve his marital difficulties. Other suitors were beginning to circle, and her reputation was already damaged by her association with the king. Mary watched this development with particular interest, because she recognized that Anne was employing the same strategy that had worked so successfully in the beginning. She was creating urgency through the threat of withdrawal. But this time, the gamble was even more dangerous. Henry had already sacrificed too much to abandon his pursuit of Anne now. He would have to find a way to marry her, even if it meant breaking with Rome entirely. As 1529 drew to a close, Mary realized that she was witnessing the end of an era. The England she had been born into, Catholic, traditional, subordinate to papal authority, was about to disappear forever. In its place would rise something new and terrible, a kingdom where the king's will was supreme, where religious orthodoxy could be redefined by royal decree, and where even the most fundamental institutions could be swept away if they inconvenienced the crown. Mary was 15 years old, and she was about to lose everything she had ever believed about the nature of authority, legitimacy, and divine order. The lessons she learned from this catastrophic transformation would shape her own approach to power when she finally claimed the throne. She would remember that kingdoms could be remade by the will of a single determined ruler. She would remember that even the most sacred traditions could be overturned if the price of maintaining them became too high. Most importantly, she would remember that survival in the Tudor court required absolute ruthlessness dressed in the language of divine righteousness. It was a lesson she would apply with devastating effect when her own time came to wield the power of life and death over her subjects. But that time was still many years away. For now, Mary could only watch and learn as her father began the process of destroying everything she held sacred, one institution at a time. As the fire crackles softly beside us, we continue Mary Tudor's story at perhaps the most pivotal moment in English history. The year 1530 dawned with a kingdom on the edge of transformation and a teenage princess about to lose everything that had defined her existence. Henry VIII had grown tired of waiting for papal approval of his annulment. Anne Boleyn had grown tired of being a king's mistress without a crown. And Catherine of Aragon had grown tired of fighting a battle that everyone except her seemed to believe was already lost. But Mary Tudor, now 14, and possessed of an intelligence that unnerved even seasoned diplomats, watched the approaching storm with the calculating gaze of someone who understood that survival would require more than royal blood. It would require adaptation, cunning, and a willingness to bend without breaking, no matter how much the bending might cost her soul. The transformation began subtly, as revolutions often do. In early 1530, Henry's advisors began to float a radical new interpretation of royal authority. Perhaps, they suggested, the king did not need papal permission to govern his own kingdom's religious affairs. Perhaps English monarchs had always possessed the authority to make final decisions about marriage, succession, and spiritual matters within their own realm. Thomas Cranmer, a Cambridge theologian with reformist sympathies, provided the intellectual framework for this revolution. His argument was elegant in its simplicity. Christ had established no earthly representative with authority over temporal rulers. The Pope's claims to universal jurisdiction were human inventions, not divine commands. Therefore, Henry VIII, as God's anointed king, possessed supreme authority over all matters within England, both spiritual and temporal. Mary listened to these arguments with the horrified fascination of someone watching a master craftsman carefully dismantle a cathedral stone by stone. She understood the implications immediately. If Henry could declare himself supreme head of the English Church, then he could grant his own annulment, marry Anne Boleyn, and declare their children legitimate, all without reference to any authority beyond his own will. It is convenient theology, she confided to her cousin Reginald Pole during one of his increasingly rare visits to court. Papa has found scholars who will prove that God wants exactly what Papa wants. Reginald, who was beginning to emerge as one of the most sophisticated critics of Henry's policies, nodded grimly. "And what does this mean for you, cousin?" Mary's answer revealed the cold realism that was already replacing the idealism of her childhood. "It means that I must decide whether I am Catherine of Aragon's daughter or Henry Tudor's daughter. I cannot be both." The choice was not merely personal, it was theological and political. To support her mother meant opposing her father's supremacy over the English Church. To support her father meant accepting that her own birth was illegitimate and that her mother was a sinful woman who had been living in adultery for 20 years. Through 1531 and 1532, Henry methodically dismantled the legal and institutional foundations of papal authority in England. The Convocation of Canterbury was forced to acknowledge him as protector and supreme head of the English Church and clergy. Parliament passed acts restricting appeals to Rome and limiting papal taxation of English benefices. Step by step, Henry was building the legal framework for his independence from Rome. Mary watched these developments with the intense focus of a student of revolution. She began to understand that her father was not simply seeking an annulment. He was creating an entirely new form of monarchy. The medieval concept of kingship, which balanced royal authority against papal and aristocratic power, was being replaced by something far more absolute and dangerous. In her private correspondence with her cousin Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, Mary demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the broader implications of her father's policies. "The king," she wrote in a letter that had to be smuggled out of England, "does not merely seek to change wives. He seeks to change the very nature of royal authority. If he succeeds, there will be no power in Christendom capable of restraining English kings from any excess their will might devise." Charles V, Catherine's nephew and the most powerful monarch in Europe, was indeed watching Henry's revolution with growing alarm. An England independent of papal authority would be an unpredictable factor in European politics, capable of allying with Protestant powers or even the Ottoman Empire if it served English interests. More immediately, Charles could not allow his aunt to be humiliated and cast aside without some response. But Charles was fighting wars on multiple fronts, against the French in Italy, against the Ottomans in Hungary, against German Protestants within his own empire. He could offer Catherine moral support and diplomatic pressure, but he could not spare the military resources necessary to force Henry back into obedience to Rome. Mary understood her cousin's constraints, but she also understood that Catherine's cause was hopeless without foreign intervention. Through careful observation of court politics, she began to see how brilliantly Henry had positioned himself. By breaking with Rome gradually, through legal and parliamentary processes, he had made it almost impossible for foreign powers to justify military intervention. He was not a usurper or a rebel. He was a legitimate king exercising what he claimed was his ancient authority. January 25th, 1533. Dawn breaks cold and grey over Dover. But in a small chamber above a chapel, history is being made in whispers. Anne Boleyn, 6 months pregnant with what everyone prays will be Henry's son, kneels beside the king as a nervous priest performs a marriage ceremony that will change the course of English history. Mary was not present at this secret wedding, but she learned of it within days through her network of informants. The news struck her like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because it made her worst fears official. Henry had married Anne Boleyn without papal approval, without parliamentary consent, without any authority beyond his own will. Catherine of Aragon was no longer Queen of England, even in pretense. More devastating still, Mary now understood why the wedding had been conducted in such secrecy and haste. Anne was pregnant, and Henry could not risk the legitimacy of his heir being questioned. This child, whether son or daughter, would be born in wedlock and would therefore take precedence over Mary in the succession, regardless of the circumstances of its parents' marriage. The implications were staggering. Mary had spent 17 years preparing to inherit the throne of England. She had mastered languages, studied statecraft, and cultivated the skills necessary to rule. Now, in a single ceremony conducted by candlelight in a seaside chapel, all of that preparation had been rendered meaningless. "I am no longer the heir to England," Mary wrote in her private journal that night. "I am an obstacle to England's heir." Through the spring of 1533, as Anne's pregnancy progressed and preparations began for her coronation, Mary found herself in an increasingly impossible position. Henry expected her to acknowledge his new marriage and accept Anne as her stepmother and rightful queen. Catherine expected her to maintain loyalty to their family and refused to grant legitimacy to what she saw as an adulterous union. Mary chose a middle path that satisfied no one but preserved her options. She would not openly challenge her father's marriage to Anne, but neither would she participate in celebrations of it. She attended court functions when commanded, but she maintained a careful distance from Anne herself. She spoke respectfully of her father's decisions without explicitly endorsing them. This delicate balancing act required enormous emotional discipline. Mary had to watch Anne Boleyn receive the honours and deference that she believed belonged rightfully to her mother. She had to smile politely when courtiers praised the new queen's beauty, intelligence, and fertility. She had to pretend that the sight of her father's obvious happiness with his new wife did not fill her with rage and grief. Most painfully of all, she had to endure the growing excitement at court about Anne's expected child. If the baby was a son, he would immediately become the most important person in England after the king himself. Mary would be relegated to the status of a supernumerary princess, valuable only as a potential bride for foreign allies. The coronation of Anne Boleyn on June 1st, 1533, was a magnificent spectacle designed to demonstrate the legitimacy and permanence of Henry's new marriage. Anne processed through London in a litter of cloth of gold, wearing robes of purple velvet and a circlet of gold set with precious stones. The pageantry was intended to rival the coronations of previous queens and to create the impression that this marriage had the blessing of God and the approval of the English people. Mary was commanded to participate in the celebrations, and she complied with the same careful neutrality she had maintained throughout the crisis. She walked in the procession, curtsied at the appropriate moments, and spoke when spoken to, but observers noted that she seemed almost translucent with strain, and that her smiles never reached her eyes. "The Princess Mary," wrote the Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuys, "conducts herself with remarkable composure, but one can see that she is suffering greatly. She has the look of someone who is grieving a death while being forced to celebrate a wedding." Anne, for her part, seemed genuinely to want Mary's friendship and support. The new queen was intelligent enough to understand that Henry's daughter could be either a valuable ally or a dangerous enemy. She made several attempts to draw Mary into her circle, offering her positions of honour at court and speaking of her with apparent affection. But Mary remained coldly polite in all their interactions. She understood that Anne's overtures were political rather than personal, and she had no intention of being used to legitimise a marriage that she considered invalid. More importantly, She recognised that any appearance of friendship with Anne would be seen as a betrayal by her mother and by the large number of English people who still considered Catherine the rightful queen. September 7th, 1533, Greenwich Palace. The same chambers where Mary herself had been born 17 years earlier now echo with the cries of another royal daughter. Anne Boleyn had failed to produce the son that everyone expected, prayed for, and desperately needed. Instead, she had given birth to a girl who would be named Elizabeth. The disappointment was palpable throughout the court. Henry had convinced himself that God would bless his new marriage with a son, and Anne had shared that confidence. Preparations had been made for a prince's christening, and the official announcements had been drafted accordingly. Instead, clerks had to hastily rewrite documents to change prince to princess throughout. Mary received the news of Elizabeth's birth with complicated emotions. On one level, she felt a cruel satisfaction that Anne had failed to produce the male heir that would have definitively secured her position. But on another level, she understood that Elizabeth's birth still changed her own status dramatically. Despite being female, Elizabeth was Henry's legitimate daughter, according to English law. She had been born in wedlock to parents whose marriage was recognised by the Crown and Parliament. Mary, by contrast, was now officially illegitimate, her parents' marriage having been declared null and void by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The legal implications were clear, but the political implications were more complex. England had never been ruled by a queen in her own right, and many people questioned whether a woman could effectively wield royal authority. If Henry died without a male heir, the succession would be disputed regardless of what Parliament had decreed. Mary began to see Elizabeth not simply as a rival, but as a potential ally. If neither of them could inherit the throne easily, they might be stronger working together than apart. This strategic thinking represented a fundamental shift in Mary's approach to politics. She was beginning to think like a claimant rather than an heir. The christening of Elizabeth took place with great ceremony at Greenwich, with Thomas Cranmer performing the service and various nobles standing as godparents. Mary was invited to participate, carrying her half-sister's christening robe in a gesture clearly designed to demonstrate her acceptance of Elizabeth's legitimacy. Mary complied with this requirement, but her participation was noted as being correct rather than enthusiastic. She performed her duties with perfect grace, but she maintained an emotional distance that suggested she was fulfilling an obligation rather than celebrating a joyful family occasion. "She handles the baby with all proper care," observed one courtier, "but she looks at her as one might look at a dangerous but beautiful serpent." This was perceptive. Mary did see Elizabeth as dangerous, but she also recognized that the infant represented both a threat and an opportunity. Elizabeth's existence proved that Anne Boleyn could bear living children, which increased the chances that she might eventually produce a son. But Elizabeth's sex also meant that Anne had not yet fulfilled her primary obligation as queen. Over the following months, Mary began to observe Anne with new attention. The queen's position, which had seemed unassailable during her pregnancy, now appeared more precarious. Henry's disappointment at Elizabeth's birth was evident, despite his public expressions of satisfaction. Anne's failure to produce a son had reminded everyone that her value to the dynasty was conditional on her fertility. Mary started to notice small signs of strain in Henry's marriage to Anne. The king's visits to his wife's chambers became less frequent. His attention began to wander to other women at court. Most tellingly, he began to speak more often about the son he was sure Anne would give him next time, as if he needed to reassure himself that this first disappointment was merely a temporary setback. Anne, meanwhile, was dealing with the enormous pressure of trying to conceive again quickly while managing the complex politics of her position as queen. She had to maintain Henry's interest and affection, cultivate alliances among the nobility, and establish herself as a legitimate royal consort in the eyes of both English subjects and foreign powers. Mary watched this dynamic with the calculating interest of someone who understood that the balance of power at court was never fixed. Anne's position depended entirely on her ability to provide Henry with sons. If she failed repeatedly, or if she lost Henry's affection for any other reason, she could be discarded as easily as Catherine had been. This realization planted the seed of a dangerous idea in Mary's mind. Perhaps Anne Boleyn's triumph was not as permanent as it appeared. Perhaps the wheel of fortune that had elevated Anne might eventually turn again and cast her down. And if that happened, Mary intended to be positioned to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. By early 1534, the constitutional crisis created by Henry's break with Rome had reached a critical point. Parliament was being asked to pass legislation that would fundamentally redefine the English monarchy and establish the succession on entirely new principles. The Act of Succession would declare Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid, confirm the legitimacy of his marriage to Anne, and establish Elizabeth as his heir. Mary found herself at the centre of this constitutional revolution. The Act required all subjects to swear an oath, acknowledging the validity of Henry's marriage to Anne and accepting Elizabeth's position in the succession. Refusal to take the oath was treason, punishable by death. For Mary, this was an impossible choice. Taking the oath would mean acknowledging that her mother had never been rightfully married to her father, that she herself was illegitimate, and that Elizabeth had a superior claim to the throne. Refusing the oath would mean defying her father directly and risking execution for treason. Catherine of Aragon, now living in forced retirement at Kimbolton Castle, sent word to her daughter through secret channels. The former queen urged Mary to refuse the oath regardless of the consequences. "It is better to die with honour," Catherine wrote, "than to live with the stain of having betrayed the truth of God and the legitimacy of our cause." But Mary's political instincts, sharpened by years of observation and study, suggested a more nuanced approach. She understood that martyrdom would serve no practical purpose if it meant removing herself from the succession entirely. Better to find a way to comply with the letter of the law while preserving her future options. When officials came to administer the oath, Mary requested time to study the exact wording. She was looking for loopholes, ambiguities, or qualifications that might allow her to swear without completely surrendering her principles. What she found was that the oath, while requiring acknowledgement of Henry's marriage to Anne, did not explicitly require her to declare her own illegitimacy. Mary's response was a masterpiece of political sophistication. She agreed to swear that she would obey her father in all matters within his authority as king, that she accepted the succession as established by Parliament, and that she would not act against the interests of Elizabeth or any future children Henry might have. But she carefully avoided making any statement about the validity of her parents' marriage or her own legitimacy. This qualified acceptance satisfied Henry's need to demonstrate that his own daughter supported his policies, while preserving Mary's ability to argue later that she had never actually acknowledged the invalidity of her birth. It was a compromise that required enormous courage and intelligence to execute, and it revealed the extent to which Mary had matured as a political actor. The oath-taking ceremony took place at Greenwich Palace in the presence of the full court. Mary knelt before her father and spoke her carefully crafted words in a clear, steady voice. Henry, who had been genuinely uncertain about whether his daughter would comply, smiled with evident relief and raised her to her feet with a public embrace. "My daughter has shown herself to be both dutiful and wise," Henry declared. "She understands that the good of England must take precedence over all other considerations." But the cost of this tactical victory was enormous for Mary personally. She had been forced to publicly accept a situation that she privately considered abhorrent. She had had to smile and speak words that felt like betrayal of everything her mother had taught her about honor, legitimacy, and divine order. That night, alone in her chambers, Mary wept for the first time since childhood. She was mourning not just her changed circumstances, but the death of her innocence about the nature of political power. She had learned that survival sometimes required compromises that wounded the soul. and that even the most principled person might be forced to choose between martyrdom and strategic retreat. As 1534 progressed, Henry's revolution expanded beyond matters of marriage and succession to encompass the entire structure of English religious life. The Act of Supremacy declared him supreme head of the Church of England, with absolute authority over all religious matters within his realm. But this was only the beginning of what would become the most dramatic redistribution of wealth and power in English history. Thomas Cromwell, now Henry's chief minister, proposed a systematic investigation of England's monasteries. Ostensibly, this was a reform measure designed to root out corruption and ensure that religious houses were fulfilling their spiritual obligations. In reality, it was the first step toward the largest confiscation of property in English history. Mary understood the implications immediately. England's monasteries controlled approximately 1/3 of the kingdom's wealth. They owned vast estates, collected tithes and rents, and had accumulated treasure over centuries of pious donations. If Henry could suppress the monasteries and seize their wealth, he would solve his financial problems while simultaneously destroying institutions that maintained loyalty to Rome. But the monastic dissolution was more than a financial measure. It was a social and cultural revolution. The monasteries had provided education, medical care, and charitable relief to the poor. They had preserved libraries, maintained schools, and served as centers of learning and artistic production. Their destruction would fundamentally alter the character of English society. Mary watched the early stages of this process with growing horror. Teams of royal commissioners visited religious houses throughout England, compiling inventories of their wealth and documenting alleged abuses. The smaller monasteries were the first targets, declared to be hotbeds of vice and superstition that needed to be cleansed for the good of the realm. The propaganda surrounding the dissolutions was sophisticated and effective. Stories circulated about corrupt abbots, immoral nuns, and false relics used to defraud pilgrims. Some of these stories were true. Medieval monasteries were human institutions with human failings. But Mary recognized that the systematic nature of the campaign suggested political rather than spiritual motivations. They are destroying 1,000 years of English Christianity, she confided to her confessor, Dr. Edward Kahn, who remained secretly loyal to Rome despite the dangers involved. They claim to be reforming the church, but they are simply stealing its wealth. Dr. Kahn, who would later flee England rather than conform to Henry's religious policies, nodded gravely. And what does this mean for the faith of ordinary people, Princess? When the monasteries are gone, who will care for the poor, educate the young, or preserve learning? These were precisely the questions that Mary was asking herself. She began to see the monastic dissolution not just as an attack on Catholic institutions, but as an assault on the social fabric that had held English society together for centuries. The king was not simply changing England's religion, he was changing its entire civilization. Through 1535 and 1536, the pace of dissolution accelerated. Hundreds of religious houses were suppressed, their inhabitants scattered, their wealth flowing into royal coffers. Some of the confiscated property was sold to nobles and merchants who supported Henry's policies, creating a new class of wealthy landowners with a vested interest in preventing any return to the old system. Mary watched these developments with the calculating eye of someone who understood that they represented both crisis and opportunity. The destruction of the monasteries was creating enormous suffering and dislocation, but it was also creating instability that a future monarch might exploit. If the religious changes proved unpopular enough, there might eventually be popular support for a restoration of traditional Catholic practices. More immediately, Mary began to understand that Henry's religious revolution was making her a valuable political asset in the eyes of foreign Catholic powers. As long as she maintained her loyalty to the old faith, she represented the possibility of eventual restoration of England to papal obedience. This gave her a form of international protection that might prove crucial if her domestic position became untenable. The execution of Thomas More and John Fisher in June 1535 demonstrated that Henry was prepared to kill even his most distinguished subjects if they opposed his religious policies. Both men had refused to acknowledge royal supremacy over the church, and both had paid for their principles with their lives. Mary attended the announcement of these executions with carefully controlled emotions. She had known both men personally. More had been a family friend, and Fisher had been one of her mother's most loyal supporters. Their deaths were intended as warnings to anyone who might consider opposing Henry's religious settlement. But the executions of Smithfield also served as confirmations of Mary's strategic wisdom in taking the oath of succession. By finding a way to comply with her father's demands without completely betraying her principles, she had avoided the fate that befell More and Fisher. She was learning that effective opposition sometimes required tactical retreat and long-term thinking rather than heroic gestures that accomplished nothing beyond providing martyrs. As 1536 dawned, Mary found herself in a paradoxical position. Officially, she was a bastard princess with no claim to the throne and no political significance. Unofficially, she was becoming the focal point for all those who opposed Henry's religious revolution and hoped for an eventual restoration of traditional practices. This was a dangerous position, but it was also potentially powerful. Mary was beginning to understand that her value lay not in her official status, but in what she represented symbolically. She was Catherine of Aragon's daughter, the last legitimate heir of the old dispensation, the potential instrument of Catholic restoration. The challenge would be surviving long enough to capitalize on that potential. And as Mary would soon discover, survival in Henry VIII's England was about to become even more difficult and dangerous than she had imagined. May 19th, 1536, the Tower of London, the same fortress where Mary's great-uncle Richard III had supposedly murdered the princes in the tower, now claims another victim. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England for barely 3 years, walks across the green toward a scaffold where a French swordsman waits to separate her head from her shoulders with a single, clean stroke. Mary was not present at the execution, but she learned of it within hours. The news reached her at Hunsdon House, where she had been living in relative isolation since taking the oath of succession 2 years earlier. Her reaction was complex. Relief, horror, satisfaction, and fear all competing for dominance in her mind. Anne's fall had been as dramatic and sudden as her rise. In January 1536, she had suffered a miscarriage that might have been a son. Henry, devastated by this loss, and increasingly convinced that his second marriage was as cursed as his first, had begun to distance himself from his wife almost immediately. By April, Anne was under investigation for adultery, incest, and treason. By May, she was dead. Mary understood the political mechanics of Anne's destruction perfectly. Her father had grown tired of his second wife's failure to produce a surviving male heir, and Thomas Cromwell had provided the legal framework for removing an inconvenient queen. The charges against Anne were almost certainly fabricated, but they served their purpose of justifying the king's desire for yet another fresh start. But Mary also recognised that Anne's execution created new opportunities and new dangers for her own position. With Anne dead and Elizabeth declared illegitimate, Mary was once again Henry's only acknowledged child. If Henry's third marriage also failed to produce sons, she might find herself restored to the succession by default. The speed with which Henry moved to remarry was breathtaking even by his standards. Within 24 hours of Anne's execution, he was betrothed to Jane Seymour, a quiet young woman from a minor noble family who seemed to represent everything Anne had not been. Submissive, conventional, and untainted by controversy. Mary watched the emergence of Jane Seymour with cautious interest. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who had been a political revolutionary with her own agenda, Jane appeared to be a traditional consort who would focus entirely on her domestic duties as wife and mother. This might create opportunities for Mary to rebuild her relationship with her father and regain some measure of influence at court. Henry's marriage to Jane Seymour on May 30th, 1536, was a deliberately modest affair designed to contrast with the magnificent pageantry that had surrounded his wedding to Anne Boleyn. The king wanted to project an image of sober respectability after the scandal of Anne's trial and execution. For Mary, the new marriage represented a chance to escape the impossible position she had occupied during Anne's reign. Jane Seymour had no particular animus toward Henry's elder daughter, and she lacked the political sophistication to see Mary as a threat to her own position. More importantly, Jane's family, the Seymours, were pragmatic politicians who understood the value of maintaining good relationships with all potential claimants to the throne. Mary's first meeting with Jane Seymour took place at Greenwich Palace in June 1536, shortly after the new Queen's formal entry into London. Mary approached this encounter with the careful diplomacy she had learned to employ in all court situations, prepared to be respectful but not subservient to her father's third wife. Jane surprised Mary by greeting her with genuine warmth and what appeared to be authentic desire for friendship. The new Queen spoke of her hope that Mary would take a prominent place at court and offered to intercede with the king to improve her daughter's position. This was a dramatic change from the complex political calculations that had characterized Mary's relationship with Anne Boleyn. "I know that you have suffered greatly," Jane told Mary during their private conversation. "It is my hope that we can begin anew as a family, united in service to the king and to England." Mary's response was carefully measured. She expressed gratitude for Jane's kindness while avoiding any statements that might be interpreted as criticism of her father's previous policies. She had learned to navigate these conversations with the skill of an experienced diplomat, revealing nothing while appearing to be completely open. But privately, Mary began to allow herself to hope that her long exile from her father's affections might finally be ending. Jane Seymour seemed genuinely interested in healing the wounds that had torn the royal family apart during the tumultuous years of the annulment crisis. More importantly, Jane appeared to have the political intelligence to understand that a united royal family would strengthen rather than threaten her own position. The summer of 1536 brought the first real signs that Mary's rehabilitation might be possible. Henry, apparently influenced by Jane's arguments, began to make tentative overtures toward his elder daughter. He invited her to visit court more frequently, consulted her opinions on minor matters, and spoke of her with obvious affection in the presence of foreign ambassadors. Mary responded to these overtures with careful enthusiasm. She understood that her father's favour was conditional and could be withdrawn as easily as it was granted. But she also recognised that this might be her best opportunity to regain a position of influence that could serve her long-term interests. The key to Mary's successful reconciliation with Henry lay in her willingness to make symbolic gestures of submission without completely abandoning her core principles. When Henry suggested that she write letters to foreign rulers acknowledging his supremacy over the English Church, Mary complied in terms that were technically accurate, but carefully ambiguous. When he asked her to participate in court ceremonies that celebrated his religious policies, she did so with dignity, but without enthusiasm. Most importantly, Mary learned to speak to her father in language that flattered his intelligence, while appealing to his better angels. She praised his wisdom in seeking divine guidance, his courage in reforming corrupt institutions, and his love for his people. She never directly challenged his policies, but she found ways to suggest that mercy and moderation were the marks of truly great rulers. This approach proved remarkably effective. By autumn 1536, Mary had been restored to the succession by parliamentary statute. Though she remained officially illegitimate, she was granted her own household, assigned apartments at court, and given an allowance appropriate to her status as the king's daughter. But Mary's reconciliation with her father came at a personal cost that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had been forced to accept, at least publicly, that her beloved mother had never been Henry's legitimate wife. She had had to acknowledge that the religious revolution she considered heretical was divinely sanctioned. She had had to smile and participate in ceremonies that celebrated the destruction of everything she held sacred. These compromises wounded Mary's soul in ways that would not become fully apparent until she claimed the throne herself nearly 20 years later. The bitterness, suspicion, and ruthlessness that would characterize her reign as Bloody Mary were planted during these years of enforced submission to policies she considered evil. But Mary was also learning valuable lessons about the nature of political power and the requirements of effective rulership. She was discovering that successful monarchs must sometimes do terrible things for what they believed to be good reasons. She was understanding that religious and political orthodoxy could be imposed through systematic violence when persuasion failed. Most ominously, Mary was beginning to develop her own vision of what a Catholic restoration might look like. If heretics could be burned to enforce Protestant orthodoxy, then heretics could be burned to restore Catholic truth. If monasteries could be dissolved to fund royal policies, then royal policies could be used to rebuild monasteries. If parliamentary statutes could be used to reshape English Christianity, then parliamentary statutes could be used to reshape it again. The seeds of Bloody Mary's future reign were germinating in the compromises and humiliations of 1536. The woman who would eventually burn nearly 300 Protestants was learning her techniques from the father who had created the precedents for religious persecution in pursuit of political ends. As 1536 drew to a close, Mary Tudor had survived the most dangerous period of her life to that point. She had navigated the treacherous waters of her father's court, maintained her core beliefs while making necessary tactical concessions, and positioned herself to take advantage of future opportunities. But she had also been fundamentally changed by the experience. The idealistic young woman who had once believed in the inherent justice of royal authority had been replaced by a harder, more calculating figure who understood that power was the only real protection against the arbitrary cruelties of the world. The girl who had once prayed for her father's wisdom and her mother's vindication had become a woman who prayed for the strength to survive until she could impose her own vision of divine justice on a kingdom that had fallen into heresy and chaos. That opportunity was still many years away, but Mary Tudor was already preparing for it with the methodical patience of someone who understood that vengeance, like justice, was a dish best served cold. The fire burns lower now, casting longer shadows across the room as we delve deeper into Mary Tudor's story. The year 1537 began with hope. Jane Seymour was pregnant, and Henry VIII dared to believe that God would finally grant him the son he had sought for nearly 30 years. But as we shall see, the birth of that son would unleash forces that would transform England into something Mary barely recognised, and plant the seeds of the religious extremism that would one day earn her the name Bloody Mary. For Mary, now 21 and cautiously restored to her father's favour, the pregnancy of Jane Seymour represented both opportunity and profound anxiety. A male heir would secure the Tudor dynasty, but it would also push Mary further from the throne and potentially expose her to new dangers if the child survived to adulthood. October 12, 1537. Hampton Court Palace. After 3 days of agonising labour, Jane Seymour gives birth to the son that Henry VIII has demanded from 3 wives across more than 20 years of marriage. Prince Edward Tudor enters the world weak and sickly, but alive and male. The guns of the Tower of London fire in celebration, church bells ring across England, and Henry weeps with joy and relief. Mary was present at Hampton Court during Edward's birth, and her reaction was characteristically complex. She felt genuine happiness for her father, who had finally achieved his greatest desire. She was fond of Jane Seymour, who had treated her with consistent kindness and respect. But she also understood that Edward's birth fundamentally altered her own position and prospects. "I have a brother," she wrote in her private journal that night. "He is beautiful and perfect, and his existence makes me superfluous." The celebrations surrounding Edward's birth lasted for weeks. Foreign ambassadors sent congratulations from across Europe. Nobles competed to offer the most elaborate gifts, and Henry ordered Thanksgiving services in every parish church in England. The king had not merely gained a son, he had achieved a dynastic security and divine vindication of his religious policies. But the joy was short-lived. 12 days after Edward's birth, Jane Seymour died of puerperal fever, leaving Henry with the son he had always wanted and a grief that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The king, who had disposed of 2 wives without apparent remorse, was devastated by the loss of the woman who had given him his heir. Mary watched her father's grief with a mixture of sympathy and calculation. Henry's genuine love for Jane Seymour had been evident to everyone at court, and her death left him emotionally shattered in a way that his previous marital difficulties had not. But Mary also recognized that Henry's grief created opportunities for her to strengthen her relationship with him and potentially influence his future decisions. She threw herself into caring for the infant Edward with an intensity that surprised the court. Mary had limited experience with babies, but she approached the task of helping to raise her half-brother with the same methodical intelligence she brought to everything else. She studied child-rearing practices, consulted with physicians and nurses, and made herself indispensable to Edward's daily care. More importantly, Mary understood that her relationship with Edward would likely determine her future position in the kingdom. If Edward lived to adulthood and inherited the throne, she would need his protection and favour to survive. By positioning herself as his devoted sister and guardian, she was investing in her own long-term security. The Princess Mary, observed the Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuys, has thrown herself into the care of the prince with remarkable dedication. She seems to understand that her future depends not merely on the king's favour, but on securing the love and loyalty of the heir to the throne. Mary's devotion to Edward was genuine. She came to love her baby brother with a fierce protectiveness that would endure throughout her life. But her care for him was also strategic. She was ensuring that Edward would grow up, seeing her not as a rival or threat, but as a loving family member who had sacrificed for his welfare. Henry, grieving Jane's death and overwhelmed by the responsibilities of caring for an infant, was grateful for Mary's assistance. He began to rely on her judgment in matters relating to Edward's upbringing, and their relationship grew warmer than it had been since Mary's early childhood. But even as Mary was rebuilding her relationship with her father, she was privately horrified by the direction of his religious policies. The birth of a Protestant heir had emboldened Henry's more radical advisors to push for further reforms that would move England decisively away from Catholic practices. With Edward's birth, Henry's religious revolution entered a new and more dangerous phase. The king had achieved his primary goal of securing a male heir, and he no longer felt constrained by the need to maintain Catholic support for his dynastic claims. Thomas Cromwell, now elevated to the position of Earl of Essex, began implementing reforms that went far beyond Henry's original break with Rome. The year 1538 saw the beginning of what historians would later call the Radical Reformation in England. Ancient shrines were destroyed, sacred relics were burned as superstitious frauds, and pilgrimages were banned as dangerous manifestations of popish ignorance. The shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury, one of the most famous pilgrimage sites in Europe, was completely demolished and its treasures seized for the royal treasury. Mary watched these developments with growing alarm. The destruction of religious sites and traditions that had existed for centuries struck her as not merely heretical but sacrilegious. These were not reforms designed to purify Christianity. They were attacks on Christianity itself, orchestrated by men who seemed determined to strip England of its spiritual heritage. The dissolution of the larger monasteries, which began in earnest in 1538, was particularly devastating for Mary to witness. She had been educated partly by monks and nuns, and she understood the crucial role that religious houses played in English society. They provided education, medical care, and charity to the poor. Their destruction would leave enormous gaps in the social fabric that secular institutions could not easily fill. "They are destroying the soul of England," Mary confided to her confessor, Dr. Edward Kahn. during one of their increasingly dangerous secret meetings. They claim to be creating a purer form of Christianity, but what they are actually creating is a kingdom without God. Dr. Khan, who was himself struggling with the demands of conforming to Henry's religious policies while maintaining his Catholic faith, nodded grimly. "And what can be done, Princess? Those who resist openly are burned as heretics or hanged as traitors." Mary's response revealed the hardening of her political thinking. Perhaps nothing can be done now, but kingdoms change and rulers die. If God preserves me, there may come a time when these injuries can be remedied and these errors corrected. This was the first clear articulation of what would become Mary's driving obsession, the restoration of Catholic England through royal authority. She was beginning to envision herself not merely as a potential ruler, but as an instrument of divine justice, who would one day undo the religious revolution that her father had unleashed. Through 1538 and 1539, Mary began to build a network of contacts with Catholics who remained secretly loyal to the old faith. This was extraordinarily dangerous. Maintaining correspondence with known papists could be construed as treason, but Mary understood that if she ever hoped to restore Catholicism in England, she would need allies who had preserved the knowledge and practices that were being systematically eliminated. Her network included displaced monks and nuns, conservative nobles who had conformed publicly while maintaining private reservations, and a handful of priests who continued to celebrate the traditional Mass in secret. Mary provided financial support where she could, helped arrange safe passage to the continent for those whose positions became untenable, and served as a focal point for hopes of eventual restoration. The most dangerous aspect of Mary's underground network was its international connections. Through her cousin Charles V and other Catholic rulers, she maintained contact with English exiles who were plotting Henry's overthrow from continental bases. Mary herself never committed to any specific plot, but her correspondence with foreign powers provided her with intelligence about her father's enemies and potential sources of support if circumstances changed. This activity required extraordinary care and discretion. Mary's letters were written in cipher, carried by trusted servants, and often hidden in seemingly innocent religious texts or prayer books. She developed a sophisticated understanding of court surveillance and learned to conduct sensitive conversations in locations where eavesdropping was impossible. The psychological strain of leading this double life was enormous. Mary had to maintain her public role as a dutiful daughter who supported her father's policies, while privately organising resistance to those same policies. She had to smile and participate in Protestant services, while secretly arranging for Catholic priests to visit her chambers. She had to express gratitude for her restoration to the succession, while believing that the religious changes that had made that restoration possible were damning England's soul. Henry's grief over Jane Seymour's death gradually gave way to practical concerns about his marital status. At 46, the king was entering the final phase of his reproductive years, and Edward, though healthy, was still a small child whose survival could not be guaranteed. Henry needed another wife who might provide additional sons to secure the succession, and he needed her quickly. Mary watched her father's search for a fourth wife with the cynical understanding of someone who had seen this process twice before. She understood that Henry's choice would be determined by political rather than romantic considerations, and that the new queen's religious inclinations would significantly influence the future direction of English policy. Thomas Cromwell, eager to cement England's break with Catholic Europe, advocated for a marriage alliance with one of the German Protestant powers. His candidate was Anne of Cleves, sister to the Duke of Cleves, and connected to the powerful network of Protestant princes who were challenging Emperor Charles V's authority in Central Europe. Mary's opinion of this proposed marriage was coloured by her understanding of its broader implications. An alliance with Protestant Germany would make it virtually impossible for England ever to return to Catholic obedience. Henry would be committed to supporting Protestant interests in European politics, and any future attempts at religious restoration would face not merely domestic opposition, but foreign intervention. When Anne of Cleves arrived in England in December 1539, Mary was among the nobles who greeted her at Rochester. The new queen was intelligent, well-educated, and politically sophisticated, but she was also unmistakably foreign and Protestant. Her presence at court represented everything that Mary found threatening about her father's religious policies. Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves on January 6, 1540, was a magnificent ceremony designed to demonstrate England's commitment to its new Protestant allies. Mary participated in the celebrations with her usual careful diplomacy, but privately, she was appalled by the theological implications of the union. However, Mary's fears about the permanence of this Protestant alliance proved premature. Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was a disaster from the beginning. The king, who had expected to find his bride attractive, based on Hans Holbein's flattering portrait, was disappointed by Anne's appearance and manner. More seriously, Anne's German Protestant background made her a poor fit for Henry's particular brand of religious reform, which maintained many Catholic practices while rejecting papal authority. By spring 1540, Henry was already seeking ways to escape his marriage to Anne of Cleves. Thomas Cromwell, who had orchestrated the union, found his position increasingly precarious as the king's dissatisfaction grew. The man who had been the architect of England's Protestant Revolution was about to become its most prominent casualty. Mary observed these developments with satisfaction tempered by caution. She was pleased to see Cromwell's influence waning, as she held him responsible for many of the religious changes she found most objectionable. But she also understood that Cromwell's fall might not necessarily mean a return to more traditional policies. It might simply mean the elevation of different advisors with different agendas. The annulment of Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves in July 1540 was accomplished with remarkable speed and efficiency. Anne, who was given a generous settlement and allowed to remain in England as the king's beloved sister, accepted the dissolution of her marriage with good grace. Unlike Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, she understood that resistance would be futile and potentially fatal. Cromwell was not so fortunate. The man who had engineered the destruction of the monasteries and the break with Rome was arrested, tried for treason, and executed within weeks of Anne's annulment. His fall was so rapid that many contemporaries struggled to understand how someone who had wielded such enormous power could be destroyed so completely and so quickly. Mary watched Cromwell's execution with grim satisfaction. She saw it as divine justice for a man who had dedicated his career to destroying England's Catholic heritage. But she also recognized that Cromwell's death did not automatically restore the religious settlement she preferred. It simply created opportunities for other factions to advance their own agendas. Cromwell's execution marked the beginning of what historians would later call the conservative reaction in Henry's religious policies. The king, now approaching 50 and increasingly concerned about his legacy, began to distance himself from the more radical Protestant reforms that had characterized the late 1530s. The Act of 6 Articles, passed by Parliament in 1539, but more rigorously enforced after Cromwell's fall, reasserted several traditional Catholic doctrines that had been questioned by Protestant reformers. Clerical celibacy was reaffirmed. Transubstantiation was declared orthodox, and private masses were declared legitimate. The act was so conservative that foreign observers wondered whether Henry was preparing to reconcile with Rome. Mary viewed these developments with cautious optimism. While the 6 Articles fell far short of full Catholic restoration, they represented a significant retreat from the radical Protestantism that had seemed ascendant just a year earlier. More importantly, they suggested that Henry was not irreversibly committed to Protestant theology and might be persuaded to make further concessions to traditional practices. The king's marriage to Catherine Howard in July 1540 reinforced Mary's hopes for a conservative turn in religious policy. Catherine was the niece of Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, who led the conservative faction at court and had consistently opposed Cromwell's radical reforms. Unlike Anne of Cleves, Catherine came from an old English Catholic family with deep roots in traditional religious practices. Mary's relationship with Catherine Howard was complex from the beginning. The new queen was barely 19 years old, younger than Mary herself, and seemed more interested in fashion, dancing, and court entertainments than in the serious business of statecraft. Mary found Catherine's frivolity somewhat irritating, but she also recognised that a politically unambitious queen might be easier to influence than one with strong personal agendas. "She is charming but shallow," Mary confided to her close friend Susan Clarencieux. "Perhaps that is what Papa needs now. A wife who will give him pleasure without challenging his authority or complicating his policies." Mary's assessment proved partially correct. Catherine Howard did indeed provide Henry with the uncomplicated affection and admiration he craved, and her influence encouraged him to moderate some of his more radical religious policies. But Catherine's political inexperience and personal indiscretions would ultimately prove catastrophic for both her and the conservative cause she inadvertently represented. Through 1540 and 1541, Mary found herself in the unusual position of being closer to the centre of power than she had been since childhood. Henry valued her judgment, particularly on matters relating to Edward's upbringing, and he increasingly sought her advice on court appointments and policy decisions. Catherine Howard, recognising Mary's influence with the king, cultivated her friendship and often deferred to her opinions on political matters. This period of influence allowed Mary to advance several causes that were important to her. She used her position to protect Catholics who were being persecuted for their beliefs, interceding with Henry on behalf of priests and laypeople who had been accused of maintaining traditional practices. She also worked to ensure that Edward's education included exposure to classical Catholic texts and traditional forms of devotion, despite the officially Protestant direction of his tutoring. Most importantly, Mary began to rebuild connections with foreign Catholic powers that had been severed during the years of her father's most radical policies. She resumed correspondence with her cousin Charles V, providing him with intelligence about English political developments while seeking assurances of support for eventual Catholic restoration. These activities required enormous diplomatic skill. Mary had to advance Catholic interests without appearing to challenge her father's supremacy over the English Church. She had to maintain loyalty to traditional religious practices without openly defying laws that mandated conformity to Reformed theology. She had to prepare for a potential Catholic restoration while accepting the possibility that such restoration might never occur. The balancing act became even more difficult when rumours began to circulate about Catherine Howard's past relationships and current conduct. Mary heard whispers about the Queen's premarital liaisons and her continued correspondence with former lovers. As someone who understood the political importance of royal virtue and the devastating consequences of sexual scandal, Mary recognised that Catherine was creating enormous dangers for herself and for the conservative cause. "She is too young and too careless to understand the responsibilities of queenship," Mary observed to Susan Clarencieux, as reports of Catherine's indiscretions multiplied. "If these rumours prove true, she will destroy not only herself, but all those who have supported her family's rise to power." Mary's fears proved prophetic. In November 1541, Catherine Howard was arrested on charges of adultery and treason. The evidence against her was overwhelming. She had indeed conducted inappropriate relationships both before and after her marriage to Henry. Her execution in February 1542 marked the end of the conservative reaction and the beginning of a new phase of political uncertainty. Catherine Howard's execution plunged Henry into a depression deeper than any he had experienced since Jane Seymour's death. At 50, the king was increasingly corpulent, frequently ill, and subject to violent mood swings that terrified his courtiers. The leg wound he had suffered in a jousting accident years earlier had become infected and caused him constant pain. More ominously, his judgment seemed to be deteriorating along with his physical health. Mary watched her father's decline with a mixture of filial concern and political calculation. She was genuinely worried about Henry's suffering, but she also understood that his weakening position created opportunities for her to advance her own interests and prepare for the future succession. Henry's sixth and final marriage, to Catherine Parr in July 1543, brought a period of relative stability to the royal family. Catherine was an intelligent, well-educated woman with strong Protestant sympathies, but she was also tactful enough to avoid challenging Henry directly on religious matters. More importantly for Mary, Catherine seemed genuinely interested in uniting Henry's children and creating the harmonious family environment that had been absent from the court for so many years. "She treats us as her own children," Mary wrote to her cousin Reginald Pole, who was now living in exile in Italy. "Edward adores her, Elizabeth respects her, and I find myself grateful for her efforts to heal the wounds that have divided our family for so long." Catherine Parr's influence proved beneficial for Mary in several important ways. The new queen encouraged Henry to restore both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession through the Act of Succession of 1544. While both daughters remained officially illegitimate, they were now legally positioned to inherit the throne if Edward died without heirs. This restoration was politically crucial for Mary's long-term plans. It meant that she would have a legitimate claim to the throne if circumstances permitted her to assert it. More immediately, it restored her status at court and gave her a platform from which to influence policy and cultivate alliances. Catherine Parr also encouraged a more scholarly atmosphere at court that suited Mary's intellectual interests. The Queen herself was a published author, having written devotional works that demonstrated both her learning and her Protestant convictions. Under her influence, Henry's court became a centre for theological discussion and literary activity. Mary participated in these intellectual activities with enthusiasm, but always with careful attention to the religious implications of the ideas being discussed. She engaged in theological debates with Protestant scholars, testing their arguments and looking for weaknesses that might be exploited in future controversies. She studied Protestant texts not to embrace their teachings, but to understand them well enough to refute them effectively. The period from 1543 to 1547 also saw Mary intensify her preparations for a potential Catholic restoration. She used her restored position at court to identify noblemen and clergymen who might support traditional religious practices if political circumstances changed. She accumulated financial resources that could be used to fund restoration efforts. Most importantly, she began to develop detailed plans for reversing the religious changes of the previous decade. "When the time comes," she confided to her closest Catholic allies, "we must be prepared to act quickly and decisively. The Protestant heresy has had nearly 15 years to establish itself in England. Rooting it out will require systematic effort and unwavering determination. These preparations were necessarily conducted in secret, as any open planning for religious restoration would have been construed as treason." Mary developed an elaborate network of coded communications, secret meetings, and hidden financial arrangements that allowed her to coordinate with Catholic sympathizers throughout England and maintain contact with potential foreign supporters. The complexity and scope of Mary's underground activities during this period demonstrate the extent to which she had developed as a political operator. The young woman who had once been content to study languages and theology had become a sophisticated conspirator, capable of organizing resistance networks and planning revolutionary changes. Henry's declining health made these preparations increasingly urgent. By 1546, it was clear that the king was seriously ill and unlikely to live much longer. Edward was still only 9 years old, which meant that his accession would require a regency government. The composition of that regency would determine the religious direction of English policy for years to come. Mary understood that Edward's minority would provide the best opportunity for Catholic restoration that was likely to occur in her lifetime. A regency government would necessarily be less stable and authoritative than a government headed by an adult king. Religious policy would be made by nobles and clerics who might be persuaded, bribed, or intimidated into supporting changes that they would never accept under normal circumstances. The challenge would be positioning herself to influence or control the regency government when Henry died. Mary's restoration to the succession gave her legal standing, but it did not guarantee political power. If Protestant nobles gained control of Edward and dominated the Regency Council, they could implement even more radical reforms while preventing any Catholic revival. As 1546 turned into 1547, Mary began to make more overt preparations for the political struggle she knew was coming. She strengthened her household guard, accumulated weapons and supplies, and established secure lines of communication with potential military allies. She was preparing not just for a religious restoration, but for the civil war that might be necessary to achieve it. January 28th, 1547, Whitehall Palace. Henry VIII, the larger-than-life monarch who had dominated English politics for nearly 4 decades, drew his final breath, surrounded by courtiers who were already calculating how his death would affect their own fortunes. The king who had broken with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and transformed England from a Catholic kingdom into something unprecedented in European history, was gone, leaving behind a 9-year-old heir and 3 potential successors, whose claims would soon drench England in blood. Mary was at Greenwich Palace when word reached her of her father's death. Her immediate reaction was complex. Grief for the loss of a father she had loved despite everything, relief that his long suffering was finally over, and anticipation of the opportunities his death might create for the restoration of true religion in England. "The king is dead," she wrote in her private journal that night. "God grant that his soul finds mercy, despite the grievous errors of his reign. And God grant that his death may open the door to healing the wounds he has inflicted upon this realm and its people." Mary's first priority was securing her own position in the new political order. Edward's succession was uncontested. Henry's will had clearly designated him as heir, and no faction had any interest in challenging the legitimacy of the only male Tudor. But the composition of the Regency government remained an open question, and Mary understood that her future would depend on whether Protestant or Catholic influences dominated the new King's Council. Henry's will had established a Regency Council of 16 members, carefully balanced between religious conservatives and reformers. In theory, this council would govern collectively until Edward reached his majority. In practice, Mary knew that such collective governments were inherently unstable, and that real power would inevitably concentrate in the hands of whoever proved most adept at political manoeuvring. Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford and the new king's uncle, moved quickly to establish his dominance over the Regency Council. Within days of Henry's death, he had manoeuvred himself into the position of Lord Protector, with near absolute authority over both the government and the person of the young king. This development was ominous for Mary's hopes of Catholic restoration, as Seymour was known to favour more radical Protestant reforms than Henry had ever embraced. Mary's response to Seymour's coup was characteristically careful and calculated. She recognised that open opposition would be futile and potentially dangerous, so she chose instead to bide her time while strengthening her own position. She publicly acknowledged Seymour's authority as Lord Protector while privately maintaining her Catholic network and preparing for future opportunities. The death of Henry VIII marked the end of the most formative period of Mary Tudor's life. She was now 31 years old, unmarried, and officially third in line to the throne after Edward and Elizabeth. She had survived her father's religious revolution, maintained her Catholic faith despite enormous pressure to conform, and positioned herself to take advantage of whatever opportunities the new reign might provide. But Mary had also been fundamentally changed by her experiences during Henry's reign. The idealistic young woman, who had once believed in the inherent justice of royal authority, had been replaced by a harder, more cynical figure who understood that power was the only protection against the arbitrary cruelties of the world. The compromises she had been forced to make, the humiliations she had endured, and the injustices she had witnessed had filled her with a burning desire for restoration and revenge. She had spent years watching Protestant heretics destroy everything she held sacred. When her time came to wield power, she would ensure that they paid the price for their crimes against God and England. The woman who would one day earn the name Bloody Mary had been forged in the fires of her father's reign. The lessons she had learned about the necessity of religious uniformity, the effectiveness of systematic persecution, and the divine authority of monarchs to impose their will on their subjects would guide her when she finally claimed the throne. But that day was still years away. For now, Mary could only watch and wait as England entered a new phase of its religious revolution, one that would prove even more radical and destructive than anything Henry VIII had imagined, and one that would provide her with all the justification she needed for the bloody restoration she was already planning in the secret chambers of her heart. The fire burns low as we conclude this chapter of Mary's story, but her tale is far from over. The young king, Edward VI, would prove to be an even more committed Protestant than his father, and his reign would see England move further than ever from the Catholic faith that Mary cherished. The seeds of future conflict were already germinating in the ashes of Henry's funeral pyre, and Mary Tudor was preparing to water them with blood when her time finally came. But that is a story for another night, as the flames flicker lower and the shadows grow longer around us.